The evening air in downtown Chicago carried the kind of weight that only came after a long day of corporate deals and endless meetings. Cars streamed along the avenues, horns echoing, while pedestrians hurried to catch trains. At the heart of this bustling world stood the glass and steel headquarters of Stonebridge Global, a company known for its ruthless efficiency, and the man who built it, Damian Cross, a billionaire whose name was whispered in every financial circle. His schedule was packed to the minute, and on this night, he was supposed to be heading into a board meeting that would decide the fate of a multi-billion-dollar merger. Yet destiny had another plan. As Damian stepped out of his sleek black car, adjusting his tie and preparing for the storm of decisions inside, he heard a sound that didn't belong in this polished environment. It wasn't the chatter of employees or the hum of traffic. It was a whisper. A trembling, broken whisper, so fragile it almost dissolved into the air. He froze, his sharp instincts telling him to turn his head toward the shadowed edge of the tower steps. There, sitting small and defeated against the marble wall, was a little girl. Her clothes were torn, her hair matted, and her wide eyes shimmered with tears. She looked no older than 6. Her lips moved, barely forming words. "It hurts, sir, please help me." The sentence pierced through Damian like a shard of glass. For a man who dealt with power brokers and politicians without ever flinching, it was astonishing how quickly his composure cracked. He crouched down, his expensive suit brushing against the cold stone, and looked into her frightened eyes. "What's your name?" he asked softly, his voice losing the steel it carried in boardrooms. The girl hesitated, clutching her thin arms to her chest. "Elena," she whispered. "He makes me eat from the floor. He touches me." Her words were broken, soaked in shame, yet they carried the weight of 1,000 alarms. Damian felt a storm rising inside him. He had heard horror stories in the news, donated to charities that promised to protect children, but nothing compared to hearing the raw confession from a trembling child inches away. He glanced at his watch. His meeting was in 5 minutes, a meeting that could shift global markets, but the thought suddenly felt irrelevant. How could profit matter when a child sat here pleading for someone to save her? Without hesitation, he pulled out his phone and canceled the board session. Gasps would echo across the upper floors, questions would erupt in the press, but Damian didn't care. He lifted Elena gently, noticing how light she was, how her body trembled even against his warmth. Her flinch at his touch tore through him, as though her soul had forgotten the meaning of safety. "You're safe now," he murmured, even though he knew trust couldn't be rebuilt in a single sentence. The driver looked stunned as Damian placed the girl in the back seat of the car. "Take us to St. Mary's Hospital. Now." The engine roared, slicing through the city streets as if fate itself cleared the way. Damian sat with Elena, speaking softly, telling her little stories about silly mistakes he had made as a boy. "I once thought a goldfish could swim in orange juice," he admitted with a small smile. For the first time, a flicker of something that wasn't fear crossed her face. She didn't laugh, but her lips twitched as though the memory of joy had stirred. At the hospital, his presence created waves. Nurses rushed forward, recognizing the billionaire instantly, yet he waved away the formality. "Forget who I am. She needs help now." Within seconds, Elena was placed on a stretcher, and Damian walked beside her, refusing to let her face the sterile hallways alone. Doctors glanced at each other, understanding the urgency in his tone. One nurse leaned closer and whispered, "Sir, we'll need to contact Child Protective Services." The words made his stomach twist. The same system that had failed her once, could it be trusted now? "Not yet," he said firmly. "Do what you must medically. I'll handle the rest." His voice left no room for argument. The medical team exchanged wary looks, but obeyed, focusing on Elena's immediate needs. Damian stepped outside the ward, pulling out his phone again. He called his chief of staff, a loyal assistant who knew how to execute without hesitation. "Drop everything. I want a full investigation into Elena Brooks, every file, every foster placement, every complaint ever recorded. And I want it discreet. If the system has buried her pain, we're digging it up." For a moment, he leaned against the cold wall of the hospital corridor, pressing his hand to his face. This wasn't a business deal he could negotiate, nor a stock he could manipulate. This was raw, human suffering that required something more than money. It demanded heart, persistence, and the willingness to defy the powerful machine of bureaucracy. When he returned to Elena's bedside, she was sleeping, her small frame dwarfed by the hospital sheets. The doctor reported bruises, malnourishment, and clear signs of long-term trauma. Damien listened silently, every word fueling the fire in his chest. He reached out and tucked the blanket around her shoulders, promising quietly to himself that she would never beg for help again without an answer. As the city lights shimmered through the hospital windows, Damien understood something profound. His life had just changed. The billionaire who once measured days in profits and deals now measured them in heartbeats. The whisper outside the tower wasn't just Elena's cry. It was a calling that would test his strength far beyond the boardroom. Morning light crept through the blinds of Damien Cross's penthouse as the city below awoke with its usual noise, but Damien's world had shifted overnight. He had spent most of the night at St. Mary's, watching over Elena, her small hand occasionally twitching as if fighting nightmares even in sleep. By the time the doctors assured him she was stable, the billionaire who once thrived on tight schedules and precise planning found himself pacing hospital corridors with no thought of balance sheets or mergers. His mind replayed her whisper again and again. "It hurts, sir. Please help me." At dawn, he finally left the hospital to regroup, his phone buzzing with updates from his chief of staff, Harper Lane. Harper's voice came through with urgency as Damien answered. "We've started digging. There are multiple reports filed under Elena's foster care placements. Neglect, malnutrition, but the records look scrubbed." Damien's jaw tightened. "Scrubbed?" he echoed, his tone slicing through the word. "Who's protecting them?" Harper exhaled sharply. "That's the thing. We traced the files to a social worker who suddenly retired 2 months ago. And the foster father, a man named Victor Hale, has a record but not under that name. He used an alias. Real name's Robert Vance. Domestic battery. Restraining orders. Buried deep, but it's there." Damien's chest burned as though every revelation was fuel poured onto fire. And the agency still placed Elena in his house. Harper hesitated before replying. "Yes. And she wasn't the only one. There are other kids tied to placements with him, some who disappeared from records entirely." Damien closed his eyes, his hand curling into a fist. "Then we dig deeper. I want every stone overturned. If someone sold her safety for convenience, I'll expose them." The next step was more dangerous. Damien insisted on visiting the foster home himself. His security team objected, warning him about the risks of confronting someone with a violent history. But Damien was unmoved. "If Elena was locked in that house, I would need to see it with my own eyes. No boardroom strategy replaces the truth." So with Harper at his side and 2 guards trailing at a distance, Damien arrived at a weathered house tucked away in a neglected suburb, where paint peeled from the walls and windows sagged with grime. Neighbors peeked through curtains as the sleek black car rolled into the driveway, curiosity mixing with suspicion. Damien ignored their stares and walked up to the front door. The house was technically empty. Victor had been arrested hours earlier after Harper leaked information to a sympathetic officer, but the shadows of what had happened inside still lingered. The stench of mildew and decay hit them the moment they stepped inside. The living room looked ordinary enough, though unkempt, but as Harper sifted through scattered papers, Damien's eyes were drawn to the basement door. He pulled it open, the hinges groaning like a warning. The staircase descended into darkness. With a flashlight in hand, he stepped carefully down the steps, his breath tight. The beam caught a small, locked closet tucked behind piles of boxes. Damien motioned to his guard, who forced it open with a crowbar. Inside, the air was suffocating. The closet was barely large enough for a child to curl into a ball. Blankets, dirty and torn, were stuffed in the corner. Scratches marred the wood on the inside of the door, desperate marks of someone clawing for freedom. Damien's throat tightened as he whispered, "My God." Harper knelt and found a small device hidden under the blanket. It was a voice recorder, old and worn. She clicked play. Static filled the basement. Then a trembling voice broke through. "Elena's. Please let me out. I'll be good. I promise I'll be good. Please don't make me eat it. Please." The recording dissolved into sobs. Damien staggered back as the sound pierced him. He had imagined her pain, but hearing it raw, unfiltered, broke something inside him. His fists clenched, not in helplessness but in a vow. The world is going to hear this. They buried her cries, but I won't. The plan was clear. Damien didn't just want to rescue Elena. He wanted to dismantle the system that had failed her. Harper raised the obvious risk. If you go public, you'll be at war with Child Protective Services, the foster system, maybe even the government. Investors won't like it. The board already thinks you're distracted. Damien's gaze was steady. Then let them think that. What's money worth if I ignore her voice? They'll call me reckless. But sometimes recklessness is the only way to make change. Back at the hospital, reporters had already caught wind of Damien's unusual absence from the board meeting. Rumors swirled, cameras camped outside. He didn't hide. He walked straight through the hospital lobby with Harper carrying the voice recorder. When the press cornered him, microphones flashing, Damien didn't give his usual corporate sound bites. He spoke directly. Her name is Elena Brooks. She is 6 years old. She was placed in a foster home where she was starved, beaten, and abused. And the system ignored her. I will not. The room fell silent, every journalist stunned. Then Harper pressed play, and Elena's recorded sobs echoed across the lobby. Gasps, tears, outrage it spread like wildfire. Within hours, the story dominated headlines. Hashtags surged online. Celebrities demanded answers. Politicians scrambled to respond. The system had thrived in silence, but Damien had torn open the curtain. Yet not everyone was applauding. By evening, lawyers representing Child Protective Services filed motions, claiming Damien had interfered with procedure. They demanded Elena be removed from his care and placed in standard custody. Damien expected it, but anger still surged. At a hastily called press conference, he stood firm. If standard custody means placing her back into the same system that lets predators walk free, then I refuse. I'll fight in court, and I'll win. His words echoed like a battle cry, carrying far beyond the walls of Stonebridge Global. As the sun set over Chicago, Damien sat at Elena's bedside again. She stirred, her small eyes opening to meet his. He smiled gently, brushing a strand of hair from her face. You're safe, Elena. You don't have to whisper anymore. She blinked, uncertain if safety was more than a dream, but her tiny hand reached out and wrapped around his finger. For Damien, that fragile grip was more valuable than every dollar he had ever earned. The courthouse was a cathedral of tension, its marble floors echoing with every step Damien Cross took as he walked into the hearing room. Rows of reporters filled the benches at the back, their pens poised, cameras ready to capture every flicker of drama. At the center of it all was a small wooden chair where Elena Brooks sat, legs too short to touch the floor, her new pink dress a fragile shield against the weight of a courtroom filled with strangers. Damien had insisted she be dressed in something that reflected hope, not the remnants of trauma. She clutched a stuffed rabbit Harper had given her, its worn ears already soaked with her tears. Across the aisle, lawyers for Child Protective Services stacked their folders with an air of confidence. They were prepared to argue that Damien had disrupted due process, interfered with an official investigation, and created media hysteria that endangered Elena's privacy. Their strategy was simple. Paint him as a billionaire meddler who thought his money made him untouchable. But Damien wasn't intimidated. He had walked into courtrooms where billions of dollars were at stake. This time, the only thing at stake was a little girl's right to live without fear. That, to him, was priceless. The judge, a stern woman named Honora Miles, opened the proceedings with a voice that carried no bias. We are here to determine custody and guardianship of Elena Brooks, currently under emergency protective order following allegations of abuse in her foster home. Her eyes flicked to Damien, then to the CPS attorneys. Mr. Cross, you are not a relative, not an approved guardian. Why should this child remain with you? Damien rose, his tailored suit immaculate, his voice steady yet pulsing with conviction. Because the system that was supposed to protect her didn't. Because her cries were buried in reports no one read. Because her foster father had a criminal past hidden by paperwork, and she was left in his care anyway. Because when I found her, she was begging on the steps of my building, whispering that it hurt. And because since that moment, I've given her what the system denied: safety, food, dignity, and the chance to sleep without fear. The CPS attorney shot up. Objection, Your Honor. Mr. Cross is appealing to emotion. This is not about grand gestures. The law requires process, not billionaire whims. Damien turned his gaze on the lawyer, unflinching. The law also requires a duty of care. Where was that duty when she was locked in a closet, scratching at wood until her nails bled? Where was that duty when her cries were recorded on a device, ignored until I played it for the world? The courtroom rippled with gasps. Judge Miles raised a hand for silence, her expression tight. I have reviewed the evidence Mr. Cross submitted, including the recording and the medical reports. I find them deeply troubling. CPS, explain how this child remained in such an environment despite prior complaints. The attorney shuffled papers, stumbling over legal jargon, but the weakness of the defense was clear. The courtroom wasn't just hearing law, it was hearing conscience. When it came time for Elena to speak, the judge leaned forward gently. Sweetheart, do you feel safe with Mr. Cross? The little girl looked up, her eyes wide but steady. She clutched the rabbit closer and whispered, He listens. He makes the bad dreams quiet. I don't want to go back. The room fell into a silence so thick it was almost holy. In that fragile moment, Elena's voice carried more power than all the attorneys combined. The decision was not immediate, but after hours of deliberation, Judge Miles returned with her ruling. Effective today, Damian Cross is granted permanent guardianship of Elena Brooks. Furthermore, this court recommends an independent inquiry into the foster care system's failures in this case. The people deserve answers. Her gavel struck, sealing the judgment that changed both their lives forever. The courthouse erupted. Some cheered, some protested, but Damian only cared about the small smile that flickered across Elena's face as she realized she wasn't going anywhere. He lifted her into his arms, whispering, You're home now. Forever. For the first time, her tiny arms wrapped around his neck willingly, clinging not out of fear but out of trust. But Damian's mission didn't end there. The media frenzy surrounding Elena's case became a movement, with public outcry demanding reform. Damian leveraged his influence not to shield his company, but to push for legislation. Within months, he stood on the steps of Capitol Hill, Elena holding his hand as he announced Anna's Voice Act, a law named not after her suffering, but after her courage to speak. The bill mandated stricter background checks for foster parents, independent oversight committees, and swift accountability for ignored complaints. The act faced resistance from entrenched bureaucrats, but Damian's persistence, combined with public pressure, broke through the barriers. He became not just a billionaire but an advocate, his fortune fueling a foundation dedicated to rescuing children like Elena. What began as a whisper outside a tower had become a roar shaking the pillars of power. Years later, as the sun dipped behind Chicago's skyline, Damian sat with Elena in the backyard of his estate, the sounds of laughter and life replacing the silence she once endured. She was older now, stronger, her eyes no longer haunted but hopeful. She leaned against him and asked softly, Why did you stop that night, when I whispered? Damian smiled, brushing her hair back. Because sometimes the smallest voices carry the loudest truth, and the world needs people willing to listen. Elena nodded, holding his hand. In that moment, it wasn't about wealth or headlines or laws. It was about love, the kind that heals wounds money never could. And as fireflies flickered in the night air, Damian knew that every sacrifice, every battle, had been worth it to hear the sound of a child's laughter free of fear. Moral lesson. This story reminds us that true power is not measured in money, but in compassion. When one person chooses to listen, to act, and to protect the vulnerable, change can ripple through an entire world. Damian's journey shows that healing takes patience, courage, and love, but even the quietest voice can spark transformation. If Elena's whisper became a movement, imagine what listening hearts around us could achieve. Remember, it's okay to feel small, because small voices still matter. If this story touched you, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, share it with friends, and comment on your lessons below.